on both LinkedIn and on YouTube. Okie dokie. Glenn has just shown up in time.
And you can hear me,
no.
yeah?
I can hear you as well. We are live, by the way, Glenn.
Cool. That's great.
We have Moshe with me. We just lost Larry.
Hi,
Let's
Glenn.
see. I'll add him back in.
Hi, Moshe.
There we go. We are live. Larry, what happened to you?
I tried to log in, but that took me to a login page, so I gave up on logging in.
Don't do that. Don't touch anything. Everything's up and working right now.
I should have done that before.
No, don't do that. All right, amazing. This is kicked off now. We're live. We're running. We're on YouTube for the first time via StreamYard. We have our guests Moshe and Larry here, and Glenn has joined me. Glenn, should we just kick off with our intros because anybody who's watching is already watching? Shall we?
Yeah, let's fly with it. Do you have the deck? Or should I go?
I do indeed. Let's start with our deck first. So whoop, here we go. This is the order of actions. I'll tell you what, Glenn, let's you and I think Jess is going to be late, so let's you and I just split this halfway and you kick things off.
Yeah, sure. So welcome everybody to the DevSecOps London Gathering. This is the first time I've used this platform, so we'd appreciate your feedback from this. But here's the rough agenda for tonight. This is just really a guide in terms of what's going to happen. So we've got two speakers tonight. The first talk will be by Larry Maccherone from Contrast. I hope I said your first name right there, Larry.
You did. Very good.
And we got Moshe Zioni from Apiro, who will be talking after that. Although we've got a break in between, we're going to try and keep that as short as possible so that we can just flow straight into the second talk. So moving on to the next slide. So here we are. This is the DevSecOps London Gathering co-organizers. There's Steve, myself, and Jess. Hopefully Jess will be joining us shortly. If you want to get in touch with us individually, then there are ways to do that via Twitter and via LinkedIn, which are those links there. So if you want to grab a screenshot, then do so. And then we look forward to hearing from you individually. Next slide. So there are other ways to get hold of the three of us from the DSOLG perspective. We have a website, DSOLG.com, which we try to keep updated regularly. The best way to get in touch with us is using our email, which is team@dsolg.com. Remember, it's team with single team. We've lost a couple of emails that have gone to Teams, but no, we're team@dsolg.com. So if you've got any questions, any queries, please do get in touch with us. We're also on Meetup. That's probably how you found us, and we're on LinkedIn. That's probably how you're watching us now. So you know those ones, and of course we're on YouTube, which is where you're watching this. We also have a podcast which we have been recording. We've got a few coming up soon. So the podcast is called DSO Overflow. What we try to do is we try to speak to some of the guests that have spoken at DSOLG and just go for a deeper dive into some of those topics that they cover, and sometimes we go off at a tangent and talk about other stuff as well. So yeah, great stuff. I can see quite a few people are joining. I saw Sam just join there from West London. So, and on that subject, well, we like to give a shout out to our fellow London meetups. There are a few out there. OWASP London, as I just mentioned, which is run by Sam. I think if I'm right, Sam, we got one tomorrow night. Just a thumbs up if that's the case. I think it's going ahead. We also have the DevOps, London DevOps, I should say, which we've collaborated with them in the past, and there's a few others as well. It would be remiss of me not to mention the Coding Black Females as well, which is a group that Jess, I believe, is involved in. Next slide. Steve, I think you're going to take it on from here.
Yeah, I have to do all the dirty work and mention our sponsors. One of our gold sponsors is Systake. I like to point out that they have a wonderful open source project for observability and security called Falco that everyone's a big fan of. And you can scale that up, as you can see on the screen, to have a full security solution prioritizing vulnerabilities, single risk, no blind spots, no noise, no black boxes. Actually, Larry, I wonder if you want to say a few words about this company right here.
Yeah, I work for Contrast Security. So we have a platform for application security, all the way from developer desktop all the way out into production. So runtime application self-protection is sort of a specialty area, and I asked interactive or intelligent application security testing instead of SAST or DAST or a combination of those. That's our claim to fame.
Amazing. Thanks, Larry. I'm sorry to put you on the spot there. Didn't prepare you for it. And finally, our other gold sponsor is Prisma by Palo Alto Networks. Very straightforward, secure infrastructure applications data across hybrid and multi-cloud environments with Prisma Cloud. They do kind of a little bit of everything. Go check it out at the links available. All right. If you would like to become a speaker like these esteemed individuals, Larry and Moshe, who are here, you can do so. And you've got a great idea, contact us at team@DSOLG.com. And hold on, I just need to change my screen so I can fit more things in it. So I can see Jessica when she shows up. She just arrived. And then there she is. 2 seconds. Let me add. There we go.
Hi, I
That's
do exist.
okay. Jess is here. And then we're moving swiftly on. Our first speaker. I don't need to introduce you, Larry. You can give us a quick intro to yourself. And then I'm going to let Moshe introduce ourselves, and then we're going to move on with our first talk.
Sure. So, you don't need to read all that either.
No.
So that's just what the PR folks send out as my bio. But the most important things to know about me, there are two of them, is that I launched and scaled the DevSecOps transformation program at Comcast over the course of 5 years, and essentially replaced the traditional way of doing AppSec with this developer-centric approach over the course of 5 years across 600 different development teams, 10,000 people in the program at the end. So I have a lot of experience in moving the needle with culture and behavior and metrics and gamification. And that's partly what I'm going to talk about here today. The other thing to know about me, the second thing to know about me, is that I'm an active developer. I'm not just preaching from an ivory tower. I actually am the primary author of a dozen open source projects, one of which gets 1 million downloads a month and is considered critical infrastructure for the United States. They actually sent me a teeny weeny check recently to maintain it. And when I say teeny weeny, I mean teeny weeny. I don't know what they expect for the money, but I guess they can claim they're paying for me to maintain it well at this point. So anyway, so I'm not, I run that project like a full development team. I have 20 collaborators on it, and all my projects have collaborators as well. I run each of them using the techniques I'm going to talk about here today.
Fantastic. And our second speaker, Moshe, just do a quick intro. You may have one in your deck already, but if you can do something for the people watching.
Sure, and thank you. My name is Moshe Zioni. I'm from Apiro, a company specified in the domain of supply chain attacks and supply chain security. Myself, I've been around for about 25 years now in the different domains in cybersecurity. From the 90s, when the Israeli scene was thriving at the time. It still is, but with a different anchor, I would say. And passed through penetration testing for about 10, 11 years. This is a big part of a chunk of work I've been doing. And through that, researching security in different domains, if it's related to incident response, penetration testing again, cybersecurity and encryption. And quite recently, in the 4 or 5 years now, I've been through application security specifically. Before Apiro, I've been a director of threat research at Akamai, which we've been developing algorithms to detect threats around 30% of the internet traffic. And Apiro, as a VP of security research, I am developing new algorithm and new detection approaches to supply chain attacks. I think that's it. Other than that, I'm a huge supporter of community relations and involved in different communities, specifically, as it's written on the screen, ShabbatCon is a security conference going on with DEF CON each year. This is actually the past 7 years now. And of course, if you are around DEF CON, say hi in the ShabbatCon security conference. That's it.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. Well, I'll take that out of there. And I believe we are, for probably the first time in the history of our meetup, we're on time.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. I think, and I believe, Larry, you're going to be up first. I can add your screen if you don't mind. Is that okay?
That sounds good. Yeah. Feel free to, I assume everyone has access to the chat. Is that correct, Steve?
So anybody who is chatting on YouTube will show up here live in our own chat, and you'll see it.
Okay.
And also if they chat on LinkedIn. But in order for us to reply on LinkedIn, I can reply directly on LinkedIn. So I'm watching LinkedIn independently. But if you're on YouTube, we can interact. There we go.
Great.
Thanks,
So
Jessica.
Include your questions for Larry right here, Jess. That's what I was hoping. That's the prompt I was trying to make. So if I see those come up, then I'll be glad to sort of respond to them immediately. And let me get going with my content. I'm here to talk about the 3 metrics every DevSecOps program, or every application security program, or every shift left program should be using and tracking and helping to improve the program with. So I gave you my intro, so I'm going to skip right past that slide. When I think of metrics, I think of metrics being useful in this context for 3 main purposes. The first purpose is to essentially drive improvement. You can do this at the team level. The development team level is what I'm usually talking about. But you can also do it at the org level as well. And when I speak of the org level, I'm usually talking about an org in the engineering group that has several teams, maybe as many as 10 or 15 teams under it in large organizations. So the metrics can be used to gamify, it can be gamify improvement. We can also use them for coaching, and that's what I'm going to show you a lot of here today too. You also, and this is a function of working in large enterprises, is you need executive sponsorship. And so at the end of every year of my program, which was launched as a pilot program at Comcast, I came to the executives with metrics that showed that we were doing better than the traditional program and at a lower cost. And that's what got me the funding to grow the program the next year. We only had 50 teams in the program in the first year. By the end, we had all 600 development teams in the program using this. So you need metrics to sort of justify your existence. And it's not just that, hey, I'm doing good. You have to actually be doing better than the alternatives. And so that's sort of tough to prove sometimes. And metrics help you with that. You also need them as a feedback mechanism for the program itself. And this is sort of a very subtle, nuanced purpose for metrics, one that you don't often get to talk about externally. I did publish a paper and give a talk at the RSA conference in 2020, where I essentially correlated the adoption of certain AppSec practices with performance, lower risk in production. And some of the things we thought were going to be great were great. Some of the things we thought were going to be great were not great. And so that was feedback we used to continue to improve the program to the point where I felt like we had it pretty well nailed down. And I'm going to give you an example of that here in a minute here. So the key practice that I will talk about are the adoption of these practices, the ones that I correlated with outcomes like lower risk in production. And so how do you measure practice maturity? It doesn't feel like a metric. Well, this is going to be the longest part of this deck. And I'm going to have to explain a little bit sort of how you do that. First of all, you need a list of practices. And so I don't want you to, this is intentionally very small, and I brought the whole list up at once because I don't want you to essentially use this as your list of practices. You can use whatever list you have, but I do recommend you do more than just adopt an industry standard one, because those are often not translatable well towards development teams. And DevSecOps is all about development. That's the dev and DevSecOps, right? So it starts with development. So you have to be relevant to developers. It's all about shifting left and getting them to take ownership of the security of the products that they're putting out there. And if you notice, 4 of the practices in my standard list, my sort of like default example list, have nothing to do with security. They can be considered prerequisites for some of the security things. But the idea here is that you can't actually get high levels of security without high levels of engineering excellence. And the hook we often use to sort of motivate developers and development teams and engineering organizations to get involved in and care about security is this engineering concept of engineering excellence or quality. And developers want to be proud of their work. And so this is a great way of doing it. This is not everything you need to do. These 4 practices are not everything you need to do to have engineering excellence, but they are the 4 that I think are sort of most relevant and most indicative that the team is ready to take ownership of the security of their products. At least the first 3 of those. The last one is not really key at first, but is something that can come later. And the other thing I want to point out about this list before we go on to sort of how we use this list are 2 other things. First of all, these 4 in the security practices, Steve and Moshe and myself all work for companies that have tools that produce findings, essentially, find problems with your code base. And so that's the source of metrics in a lot of cases. And it's the source of 2 of the 3 metrics I'm going to talk about here today. But the way you go about getting development teams to effectively use those tools, I think, is actually more important than which individual tool you pick. And these 4 practices, broken down the way that I've broken them down here, I think were one of the keys to our success at Comcast. Notice how we don't say get scanning going on all of your applications. That's not a practice here. We don't even say for an individual team, get your scans going. I don't care about scanning in general. In fact, an inventory of findings is of net negative value to me because that creates a liability and you had to do work to generate that. All of the value comes from resolving them. And so these practices are worded around the resolution and the staying clean for that sort of category. So critical clean for third-party code you import, software composition analysis, SBOM, that basically it says get clean, get to 0, and stay clean. Put in place a merge blocker that keeps you clean. And the same thing for the code you write, and then the high severity and the high severity. I don't list medium severity as one of the top practices, but that's sort of on the list in the next round. The second thing I want you to notice about this list before we move on is that everything has a weight. And this weighting is what changes most when I launch a new organization on this coaching, this practice maturity transformation program. Everyone sort of picks their own weights. The engineering practices change pretty dramatically as well. But the weight, I think, is really important because it tells developers what the focus is, and they can prioritize that. Maybe I can do this thing that is only 3% really easily, but it's going to be harder to do this 12% thing. And so they get to make a trade-off decision about what to do first. Eventually, you want them doing all of them. But at first, most teams in an enterprise are not doing most of these, very effectively. So that's the list of practices to start with. So how do you use this list of practices? Well, you coach. And if you're familiar with the Ted Lasso TV show that's on Apple Plus, Ted Lasso it's a great show, by the way. You should watch it. But Ted Lasso is a coach for American football. You know, that weird shaped oblong thing that you might use something similar in rugby over on your side of the pond. American football. But he's hired to be the coach of a European football team, soccer, we would call it over here. He knows nothing about soccer, but he does know about getting the best out of people. He does know about getting them to work together. And so this concept of coaching, I think, is critical. And so for each practice, you want to coach the team through various stages of maturity. At first, they haven't thought much about it. Then they're now starting to talk about it. Once you mention it, they'll be starting to talk about it. They're making plans to adopt it, what it would take to adopt it. Actions means we've partially adopted it. We're getting some value out of it. Maybe we're doing it for 3 of our 5 apps. And then culture is we wouldn't think of doing it any other way. Now, one of the things I learned in doing the analysis of this is that you really only get credit when you get to culture. If you give partial credit for words and actions, it's actually demotivating. And so you really want to drive everyone to get to the level of culture. And when I say you wouldn't think about doing it any other way is culture, I don't mean that you misapply it. I don't, for contexts where a certain practice doesn't apply, you have to be able to mark it as not applicable. But yes, for every place where it does apply, then you should be doing it. And so you coach teams through this thoughts to words to actions to culture. THWAC is the acronym that we use to do that. And when they get to culture, they get those percentage points for that practice. So that's the way you use the practice adoption metrics. How do you use this? In a coaching session you host with the development team, you start with that list of practices, and it's a conversation. It's not a verbal survey. You're not getting them to just tell you, yes, we do this one. No, we don't do this one. Next, we don't. Can we leave now? You don't want that. You want the conversation to be about, so this practice makes sense to you? Do you understand what it means? Are you doing this? Can you pull up the data for how you're doing it? How could you be doing it better? If you're not doing it, what would you need to change in order to be able to do it? So it's all about planning and getting the team to make a commitment. We're going to improve 1 to 3 of these things. We're going to get 1 to 3 of these things, these 13 things, these 13 key practices I showed you to culture in the next 90 days. And that's the key. You coach them to try to improve every 90 days. And you ask them to only focus on 1 to 3 of them. You don't ask them to do a little bit on all 13 of them, because that's not effective. You only get the credit when you get to full culture for that. And then you come back every 90 days and you recoach that team and help them sort of pick another 1 to 3 practices. When you do that, you get this visualization, and this is a visualization of 10 development teams worth of data. So each arc represents a self-assessment. The teams were all at culture, and one team was unassessed for secrets management. And so they were doing really good with this organization, this 10-team organization was doing really good. And then you can see the trend over time overall with this. They were doing less good in some of these other practices. And so you can visualize the data this way. I have a tool that helps you to visualize this and helps you to coach with this and pick your list of practices and set the weights for them. It's called transformation.dev blueprint. If you go to transformation.dev blueprint, you can sign up for the beta. Right now it's in alpha, private alpha, and I'm only making it available to teams that I have to organizations I have a consulting relationship with, but we're getting very close to opening it up so that anyone can use it ad hoc. I need to put a lot more sort of guardrails in it to make it easier to use, and that's the work that we're still working on. This is one of my side projects, one of my open source side projects. This approach works. At Comcast, we had 1/6 as many vulnerabilities in production, and it cost 1/4 as much to run my program as the traditional one. And it scales really well. You can spread this across an entire organization. You have to do some federation, and I have a whole sort of way of launching organizations. I can't give you all of that information in this talk, but basically I have a whole sort of packaged way of doing this as a professional services offering that uses the transformation.dev blueprint tooling. And eventually you'll be able to do it without the professional services. Maybe you can just do it with the tool that provides the coaching in the tool. Okay, so that's key metric number 1. And so key metric number 1 is this practice maturity metric using this weighting. And you want to sort of do this over time. So you want to have a leaderboard of, say, the most improved in the last 90 days or the top scoring teams, leaderboard for that. And that's how you gamify that particular metric. And you can do it at the org level, and that's probably the more effective way to do it. So when you have a whole org's worth of data, you can sort of add up all the dark green bars essentially, and the percentages that are associated with them, and that is the score for the whole org. And so you can get 2 orgs competing essentially. I had one business unit leader at Comcast challenge another business unit leader to have the most improvement in their maturity score in the next 90 days. And the loser had to wear a bunny suit during Easter week of that year. And so it was kind of fun. And one of them did have to wear a bunny suit, go to lunchtime. And so we really gamified that really good. So moving on to metric number 2 is MTTR. And some of you are probably going, what is MTTR? I'll explain what the traditional definition of MTTR is, but the comma, but, ... is there, is that I sort of changed the meaning of the acronym a little bit when I talk about MTTR. Most people think it means mean time to remediate vulnerabilities. And that's sort of the common definition. And we're going to tweak that here a little bit. So basically it's the time open for findings resolved in the last n days. You can have an MTTR over the last 90 days, for instance, or over the last year, for instance, if you're doing sort of, annual reporting kind of things. The shorter you make the window, the more spurious the metric is. And so it's sort of, you got a trade-off. When you're rolling it up across an entire organization, you can have a shorter window, like 30 days, and it's not going to jump around all the time. But if you have an individual team, it's sort of very spurious and jumps around a lot. So you have to be careful about what N you use for those N days there. This is the absolute best metric for doing retrospective analysis. It's the feedback metric I use to sort of correlate practices with sort of a relatively leading indicator. The vulnerabilities found in production was sort of a lagging indicator, though, and that was sort of the more predictive one, especially because we weighted it with severity as well. This is perfect for doing annual reporting as well, or reporting over the last several years, for instance, would also be really great. This is the ideal metric for that. That has some problems, though. So especially if you're trying to use it to drive behavior of an individual team or for an individual app, it really is ineffective for that, because it motivates sort of a bad behavior. If you have a really old vulnerability that's been around for 400 days, for instance, it's not in your MTTR. It's never been in your MTTR because it only counts the ones that have actually been resolved. As soon as you resolve it, it gets added to the MTTR calculation. If your MTTR was 30 days before or 3 days before, adding a 400 to it's going to throw the mean way off. And so MTTR is sort of traditionally defined. MTTR is sort of bad for this purpose because it went from being 3 days up to being 200 and some days because that 400 got added to the average. So it's not ideal for that situation. If you insist upon using MTTR for driving improvement, though, then include the currently open ones in the window, whatever window you're calculating. That's fine for the current window, but you can't really do it for past windows because you don't know what the current was at the end of that. So it's really sort of a little odd unless you recorded it back then at that point. But my metric number 2 is a better metric for driving behavior. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit here. The other change I make to this is I don't want you to use the mean. I want you to use the, I don't want you to have the R in MTTR mean resolve, or mean remediate. Sorry, I keep getting the wrong words here. So let me start over for this bullet. MTTR means mean time to remediate most of the time. I'm going to change some of those words. The first word I'm going to change is the remediate. I want you to substitute that with resolve. And the reason for that is that if somebody marks something valid, false positive, as a false positive, you want them to get credit for that. And so if you just say remediate, that means you actually fixed something, you did something, you remediated the problem. Resolve, though, means you resolved the finding. You either declared it as false positives or you remediated it, are sort of the two main choices. But there can be other states, ending states for, like risk accepted might be an end state for yours. And so that might be something you want to give people credit for if there's been a decision to accept the risk. Okay, so I also want to change the M from mean to median. And the reasons for this are a little bit sort of math-oriented, statistics-oriented. They're going to be very similar if you have a normally distributed curve or close to normally distributed, and you have enough data points. They're going to be very similar if it's normally distributed and you have enough data points. However, time, MTTR, time to remediate, is zero bound unless you have a time machine. And so you tend to have an asymmetric, non-normal distribution of time. And the mean is a really bad representation from a statistics perspective of the center of that, of a non-normally distributed curve. And so statisticians will tell you you should use the median as the center for that instead. The 50th percentile is the equivalent of the median there. So it's a little subtle. It's also less spurious when you use the median. So if you have a 400 in there, it's less likely to change the number. And it means that the fat tail sort of doesn't overwhelm the bulk of the data here. But I actually found via experimentation that the 75th percentile for highs and mediums is a better indicator of the performance of the team. And the 95th percentile is a better indicator of the performance for critical vulnerabilities. Basically, you care a lot about sort of like the worst case scenario. It took us 10 days to resolve a critical. You want to know that. And so the higher the percentile is sort of the closer to that worst case scenario you're getting. Some folks might go to the 99th percentile, or some folks might even go to the max time to remediate a critical. And so that sort of is when you get more mature. You want to push that up to the 99th percentile or the 100th percentile, for instance. But for the average organization, the 95th percentile is a great sort of metric. The problem with that is then you lose the acronym MTTR here. So I've got some questions coming in. Larry, would modal also be a good indicator of health? Modal, I'm not sure what that means. So maybe clarify that, and I'll be glad to answer that when we get to a little bit later here. You also want to measure these things separately for each criticality. And so you want to have a separate MTTR for criticals, severity, separate for critical severity, separate for high severity, separate for medium severity. Now, where you draw the lines between critical and high and medium is an exercise left up to you. But wherever you draw those lines, and you can even have more states, severity categories, but you should measure them MTR separately for each of those. Okay, moving on to metric number 3. This is my better metric for driving behavior, cumulative days open. And so the definition of this is essentially the sum of the days open for all currently open findings. And so what this does is this actually rewards you the most for closing the oldest vulnerabilities. And there's an argument to be said that the oldest ones are actually the most risky, especially for open source vulnerability findings, because the attackers have had more time to sort of figure out how to attack that in the wild. And so this sort of correlates nicely with motivating the behavior, but it doesn't suffer from the same problems that an MTTR does in terms of you close the oldest one, you get the most points reduced. It improves the score the most when you close the oldest one. So the sum of the days open for all currently open findings means that if one was open yesterday, that's only going to count as a 1. If it was open 10 days ago, that's going to count as a 10. So that's 10 times worse on your score. And if it was open 100 days, it's 100 times worse for your score. So this really motivates you to focus on the oldest ones first. It's the best metric I found for driving improvement. Again, you also should measure it separately for each severity. Also, in order to make this the most useful, you want to normalize it by the number of findings added in the last year. This makes it comparable across teams and across orgs when you normalize it. So if you have a big org or a small org, they're going to have higher cumulative days open for a big org than for a smaller org. But if you normalize it by the number of vulnerabilities opened in the last year, that tends to make it comparable across organizations or across teams. And a measure separately for each severity was so important, I had to say it twice in my deck. Sorry about that, guys. So that's a typo there. Okay, so those are my 3 metrics. We could stop the talk here, but I'm going to give you a couple of sort of bonus sets of information here. I often hear about folks using percentage of applications scanned. And, this can be a useful metric at times, but it tends to make the focus be on expanding the footprint of the tool usage. Now, as a tool vendor, we love that, right? So you use more licenses, you maybe have to buy more licenses. That's great, but getting to the resolution is the key. And so, actually, as a consultant, I tend to say, don't spread the tool as far and wide as you can. Just put it with one team in one app and get them to resolve all the criticals from that tool before they move on to all the highs for that tool, and make the focus be on the resolution. And then you don't spread the footprint of the tool usage until you feel like you've got progress going in one smaller part of the organization. Open vulnerabilities. So this is useful if it's near 0, but if it's not near 0, cumulative days open is just sort of a much better metric. And so I recommend CDO over open vulnerabilities as a metric. And vulnerabilities closed. And this is the one that was used at Comcast before I started more than any other metric. But the funny thing is that every year or every time period that they bragged about how many vulnerabilities were closed, they actually opened more. They injected more vulnerabilities into their products than they were removing from their products. And so their risk profile was getting worse and worse over time. And so this is actually a pretty bad metric. This can be a dangerous metric. I call it a vanity metric. It makes you sort of like your AppSec program go rah, rah if the numbers are in the thousands. But it really is a very misleading metric, and I don't recommend using it at all. The next sort of slides are going to be borrowed from the lean manufacturing and lean software development worlds, which are all based on this concept of theory of constraints. And they use this visualization called a cumulative flow diagram as the primary way to sort of talk about metrics. You can almost all the metrics we've talked about before can be represented in a cumulative flow diagram. But the beauty of this is really at a glance, you can really sort of see whether something is healthy or not. So how do you read a cumulative flow diagram? Well, this top orange line goes up when new vulnerabilities are found. The green line catches up with them when they're resolved. And then this blue area is when things are marked as false positives. And so this is a sort of example of the vanity metric situation. A lot of vulnerabilities got resolved, right? They're in the 1,200, 1,400 range for the vulnerabilities that got resolved in the last year. The thing goes back, the chart goes back a year. But their risk is actually higher than it was a year ago. So, they're getting worse. And most of the benefit came from marking a bunch of stuff as false positives. And I guarantee you that most of those weren't really false positives. They were just, hey, there's now a big gap in our open vulnerability count where we're reporting that the boss got worse. So we have to resolve a bunch of them. So we're going to mark a bunch of them as false positives. So this is a very unhealthy graph. And in an instant, you can tell this is unhealthy use with this cumulative flow diagram. This is a very healthy usage of it. Basically, it took a while for resolution to sort of get some momentum, but once it did, it took off really fast and it caught up with it. The other thing to notice is that the vulnerabilities are not being injected over time very much. So this flattens out. All the learning that occurs when a team does this resolution means that they don't write those same kind of vulnerabilities much anymore. And it's only new kinds of vulnerabilities. And so this is a great way to sort of coach with, and we use this to coach with at Comcast. So the vulnerability revival rate is that top curve. So that was on that chart. And then that false positive graph is very useful as well. We didn't actually sort of ding folks for using false positives, but if somebody had a spike in false positives, we went and met with the team and asked them what was going on and tried to figure out if they sort of maybe had some trouble with the tool, and we could improve the tool to have lower false positives and that sort of thing. So good feedback thing that shows up in the cumulative flow diagram. You also have the current open trend as well on there. I do want to reference that talk I gave at the RSA conference in 2020. Basically, it showed the impact of DevSecOps quantified using metrics. This is 1/6 as high as this. That's the 1/6 as many vulnerabilities found in production. And if you watch this video, it's 50 minutes long. It really sort of gives you a sort of a deeper understanding of sort of how you use metrics to improve with. And this is sort of the list of practices that and I've changed this a lot, so I'm not going to stop on here, but this is in the deeper explanation of this is in that whole talk there. I mentioned contrast, but this is my slide to do that in case we didn't get a chance to introduce contrast, but as a sponsor we did. So this is my slide here to mention our platform for contrast. And then this is my final slide here, where you can please connect with me on LinkedIn to ask me questions I don't get to answer here. Do we have time to answer questions, or am I over my limit here, Steve? I think I'm right at my 30 minutes.
You're close, but we've got some crossover time, and we've got one pretty good question from Duncan. Did you see that in the comments?
No. Let me do that. Okay, so question for Larry from Duncan Herwood over on YouTube. I like this, but it all sounds quite security team heavy. How big a security team did you need per dev team or per dev? In essence, how big does your team need to be in order to get value from this framework? So it is security team oriented, yes. So I'm less dev oriented, although the list of practices at the beginning, 4 of those were engineering oriented, and you could add more of those. So one of the metrics actually is dev or ops oriented as well. It can be adjusted based upon what practices you pick. But you're right, the rest of them are more dev oriented. Although cumulative days open is a metric from the quality world for defects, and the MTTR is also a metric from the quality world for defects, but the equivalent of that is cycle time or lead time. It's basically the same metric, just with a different name and a different flavor. So all 3 of these metrics really have roots and can be applied with some tweaks to the non-security context. The second part of your question, I think, is actually more interesting. And most people think, hey, this doesn't scale. How can I coach every development team using this? This is not going to work. I only have one person in my small org that does security work. It scales amazingly well. In fact, it scales better than what you're probably doing today in terms of getting to more teams and getting more results with less human resources. 1/4 as many resources is what we found at Comcast. And let me give you a sort of quick math to sort of let you know this, let you sort of get a feel for this. You're coaching every development team every 90 days. And the first coaching session takes 90 minutes, but the subsequent ones only take 60 minutes because they're sort of used to the approach and such. So on average, let's call it 1.25 hours, 1.25 hours per workshop that you do with each development team. Well, you can do 10 of these a week, 10 of these workshops a week. Or if you don't have 10 development teams at your org, it's only going to take up a small portion of your week as a security person doing these workshops, coaching to this list of practices. And there's 10 weeks in a quarter, and you come back every 90 days. So 10 times 10 is 13 weeks in a quarter, right? But I took 3 out for vacation and group meetings and stuff. So 10 times 10 workshops per week times 10 weeks in a quarter. One coach can handle a maximum of 100 teams and still have 2/3 of their time left free. Now, generally, we didn't have a single coach with 100 development teams responsible for. I think the max we had was about 90, and the sustainable one for a dedicated coach was about 75. But right, so that was sort of gave the coach a chance to sort of contribute more to other aspects of their work. And federated coaches maybe only had 3 or 5 teams they were responsible for using this same framework. But those federated coaches used a much smaller amount of their time using this approach than they did using their other cajoling approach. So it scales very, very nicely. Is that the only question you wish me to answer live here, Steve?
I think, unless there's another one, because Jessica was asking about modals and there was a clarification. I don't know if Jess wants to step in and make any further clarifications on that. If Jess can hear me.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've answered it with the subsequent metric, but I was just kind of wondering whether or not seeing the
the mode, not modal. Yeah, okay. The mode I would have called that, not the modal, but yeah, the most frequent value in the data.
yeah, so sorry.
Yeah, I could talk on that because I do have a deep statistical background. Machine learning algorithm is one of my projects, and all of my projects have to do with data and visualization. So I'm very data oriented. Obviously, I'm giving a metrics talk, right? So I could talk about the mode at length, but no, the mode is not a one that I think is very useful unless you have sort of a very small, discrete set of outcomes. So anyway.
Okay, cool. I think we're kind of at end of time because we're going to move on to Moshe. But before we do that, Contrast has been generous enough to give us a prize draw.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, so I'm going to pop that. And Jess, I don't know if this goes, maybe you could double check this goes to LinkedIn. Okay, I went to YouTube. I will do one little thing here. I will pop it up on the screen just so that people who are wondering what it's all about can see it and panic and want to run and actually fill it all in.
The prizes are really good. So, and we're not just saying that; they really are great prizes.
There we go. So go to that link. Bose headphones, and most importantly, I mean, come on, Bose headphones, they're not very good. Lego Advent Calendar. I mean, check it out. So,
and that's just a prize draw for this event, right? It's not like
that's it.
Yeah, just for this event. So that's a dedicated page just for this event. So
just for this event, and and the closure ends midnight tonight, the 14th of December. So if you're watching this now, or you got here late, and it's like 11:59, and you're like, oh my god, and you just saw this bit, and you got the link, and you could see it. Go there, fill this in. Click enter, and you have a shot at winning this. Your draw will take place tomorrow, and you'll be contacted on your email provided. So, kind of a big deal. Go check that out. The chat will be maintained, so if you are watching this in real, like in post time, you will see the link come up exactly there. So you're not going to miss out on it. So I had to mention that. Big shout out and thanks very much to Contrast Security for providing a pretty amazing prize. All right. Thanks, Larry. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. Great stuff.
Quiet muted applause.
Thank you for having me. So yeah.
That's incredible. All right.
We go through the microphone through like surpass a mute, but apparently not. So but here we go.
There we go. All right. Moving swiftly onward, because it's just been made aware to me that there's a World Cup game tonight, and my wife is kicking my backside for having a meetup in the middle of it. But there we go. Moshe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Great session, Larry. Thank you very much. So what we're going to do right now is to shift gears to something much more specific, like a single case of a 0-day. We've discovered a specific CI/CD software. But before that, just to set the stage and to tell you a bit about security research around supply chain vulnerabilities, I'm here to also discuss that. I also introduced myself, so I won't repeat that. Unless you are late here, I don't think that you'll miss much. Just as a highlight, Apiro is a software supply chain security solution startup, and we are discussing today a specific case of a vulnerability that was found in a program named AlgoCD. We'll talk about it and what is AlgoCD in a second. And of course, why this vulnerability makes a spotlight today and why it's so important in our opinion, and globally as well. What was the impact of that? So we're going to go through that and then to discuss research, how the research is done, what is the general approach, which, by the way, you can copy-paste the approach to any kind of research approach. But in this case, we'll also hone down on how this kind of approach was applied to this kind of research. And then to go through the discovery of the details themselves and the nitty-gritty details of the Argo CD ecosystem and the code itself and how it was discovered. Then we are going to discuss the attack path and what kind of attacks can be happening under this kind of vulnerability. And then, of course, remediation, part of it is generic, and then some will touch upon what Argo CD can do entirely differently in order to combat those kind of attacks in the future. And again, we'll summarize and Q&A is at the end. But also, if you have questions in between, feel free to ask the comments. I'm sure that the guys here will moderate and tell me that if I'm missing something. I have it open as well, so I'll try to look at it in between. If you have something more complex to ask, maybe it will be better to ask it at the end. But of course, if you feel like it, just ask, and we'll handle it as graceful as I can. So let's dig into it. What is Argo CD? I can't say with a show of hands, but in general, if we are discussing DevSecOps today, so I would assume that part of you, a large sum of you, will know about Argo CD. Argo CD is a solution that is focused on the CD operation of the CI/CD. It's an open source declarative. It just graduated, by the way, by the CNCF, so congrats to Argo CD on that, which is a continuous delivery tool for Kubernetes systems and applications. It's a truly cloud-native CD platform. The platform itself is also Kubernetes-based, and it supports the usages that you might think of about applications. It has a specific application packaging YAML configuration format and parsing, and it's part of the culprit of this kind of attack as well, just as a foreshadowing what we're going to discuss. And it's packaged all together into a manifest. There are multiple ways to enact this kind of those kind of systems as well. It's, of course, as a SaaS solution, if you are putting it on cloud, it's a multi-user. It's an on-demand automation. It's supposed to be end-to-end automation once you have this set correctly and to good extent. Now, some security considerations off the bat without even discussing the vulnerability. Of course, this is kind of a how do you store and version your manifest. The usual suspect there will be some kind of a Git-based or SCM-based control over the manifest that you have for the application. So you have some kind of a GitOps going for that as well. An RBAC or role-based access controls, which also supported by the Argo CD by definition, but it goes with Kubernetes. If you ever set up RBAC with Kubernetes, you know it's not still streamlining process as we like. I would say as a security practitioner for a second, but still it supports RBAC and something to be considered. It's supposed to deploy instances on different environments. So you have to adjust your kind of application manifest to the environment that you would like to go through. But usually it's a small changes to you, so you'll be able to quickly shift gears to a specific environment that you have in mind now. And it also has Vault and secrets management built in. So this is also a consideration as in any case. But besides that, the application manifest themselves can also hold secrets in tokenized form or in free form, which will all tell you, of course, this is not a good practice, but you should have some kind of a vault or tokenization mechanism to be able to handle those kind of secrets properly. And then you have the connectivity and integration with a CI. So they are very open to CI systems because they are not intended to be a CI. So, of course, this is part of the premise itself. Altogether, I have to say, on a personal note, I love Argo CD. I love using it. I love that it's a very big operation in terms of open source. As I said, it just got graduated, which means that it's passed the bar on all checks for the CNCF. It's been a CNCF project for a while now, and now just a few weeks ago, it's been graduated. And I'm proud of that for them, meaning that it's a really great architecture and a really great guys as well. And you also see by the how swift they were to respond to that, which was amazing. I've been reporting vulnerabilities for the past maybe 15, 17 years for different companies, if it's Fortune 500 and if it's something very, very small. And this was maybe the quickest remediation attempt, and of course the communication between us and them were just great. So I'll repeat that if you don't mind another time at the end resolution of remediation as well. Why does it matter? Because you have a number for the CVE, it's 2022 24348, which means a lot, of course. But why this specific CVE of all the CVEs that we have, which is the tens of thousands a year, should matter right now? So for us, it has a very, very good reason for that. It's not the most dangerous vulnerability out there, just to set the stage for you. So in contrast to what you think, maybe it's not the most dangerous. So again, what should it matter? Targets, it does target critical supply chain junction. It's a very popular CD infrastructure, and this is a pro for why it matters, but still doesn't really bolt it down for the question that I have in mind. And it's utilized through a payload by a native supply chain artifact, meaning that you use an actual Helm chart in order to sustain the attack itself and to come across those kind of artifacts as well. What's important here is that it does combine specific attack patterns that is very deadly but silent, meaning that it's not an RCE. It will be very, very hard for you to monitor for those kind of attacks unless you have this kind of attack in mind and you would like to maybe monitor something. And still, it will be very, very difficult. Once we go through the next slide, you'll understand better what I'm talking about, of course. And also, it has a lot of without using too much buzzwords here, but in the supply chain attacks, you have the supply chain, the software supply chain, the steps that the software itself go through in order to be built and then deployed. And also it utilizes this specific supply chain in order to gain, to attack themselves as a supply chain mechanism. So in combination, and also, again, foreshadowing for the next step, is also using a very sensitive data, namely the secrets that you have on those kind of machines and CDs that you are relying heavily on. And those kind of combinations and supply chain buzzwords, bingo, you have all of those checks checked out. And by that, for us, it's greater than 1 + 1 = 3 in this manner. And lastly, as we'll see, the attack path itself, it was actually even predicted 2 years ago by the developers. They dabbled into that. They conversed about it. Again, because it's an open source, it's easy for us to see that. The conversations are open source, the PRs are open source, the commits. It's all on GitHub, so it was very easy once you are into that kind of thing to cross and to see the history of those kind of code. You can just do git blame on a specific code line or lines, and to be able to see who provided this code and when, and if there is some kind of a PR related to that, you'll be able to see the conversation. And that's exactly what we did. So we're going to go through the history of that. And the history is very, very important because, as I said right now, they knew about this kind of attack. They predicted it, and then employed some kind of a mechanism to throw away this kind of attack altogether. But then again, the mechanism was unfortunately buggy, so they couldn't catch it in time. But also on top of that, we'll reveal more of those kind of conversations and what went wrong there. Not to shame anyone, of course, this can happen to any kind of respected open source and commercial software development steps. So again, but the openness of this kind of conversations gives us a lot of insight about how software is being built and what went wrong and where. So let's talk about the discovery itself. As I said before, the research approach is pretty, I would say, systematic. I'm using the same approach for, I would say, 95 or maybe 98% of all research attempts that I have on my hands. The general theme is that first you explore, you have to be familiarized, specifically if you are new to a project. Let's say you have something in mind because if you have this kind of security research in mind and you are using some kind of a software on your premise and you are interested to see how secure the software is. So this is a very basic example that you need to familiarize yourself with the project, documentation, what it does per documentation. Of course, this is not covering what is undocumented, which is a great theme in research and discovery as well. So this is the first step, to explore the system, to know about the ecosystem, to know about maybe some of the architecture, but maybe some kind of high level of the architecture. And then once you realize those kind of explorations and you have enough ground to base your research upon, at least what kind of flows you would like to detect and what kind of mechanisms are more important than others, either in terms of security concerns, and maybe you're just interested in that because you have a knack for, let's say, encryption, if that's your thing. So you are homing down on the use cases that you would like to go, or the flows of inputs to outputs. Some will call it sources and sinks. And by that, you'll be able to realize the use cases you would like to home down on. And then you are going for the whole 9 yards on to the mechanics themselves and to reading every bit of code quite literally, in order to really understand what is going on, and to, by that, of course, extrapolate what can go wrong, and how to test for those kind of cases, and to prove. Your goal, of course, every kind of exploration like that is to, at the end goal, is to have enough proof to understand, first of all, that you are not missing something out. Like, let's say you're using non-default values, for example, for the installation of the Argo CD or any kind of other software, or maybe you have a very specific environment that in your case, your proof of concept for the attack will work, but in any other case, or most cases, won't really fall into that. And there are many cases like that I can talk about maybe on different talks in the future as well. So once you have this kind of mechanic in mind, after the use cases, you are homing down on a very specific code or code segments. And by that, some of you will think about it as drawing lines from detective work. And it's pretty much like that, because you need to understand what goes where and when, and to stop for a second and then deep dive into something else. So you'll be able to come with all the information in order to converge into a vulnerability. In this case, for Argo CD, the project itself is written in Golang. So that's something that is very, as you might know, very common in open source projects regarding Kubernetes and Argo and the CD or CI systems. The Go is the go-to programming language in many cases of those softwares. So in this case, it's now different. They are using Go, and the Go system is first of all, you have an application. This is an entity in the Argo CD realm. The application itself has a application manifest, and the application manifest is actually a Helm chart, some sort of a Helm chart with some, I would say, garnish around it, in order to provide a application packaged from one place to deployment itself. So what you see here is a very short demo, a very short sample of a manifest of some sort. A very generic one. You have the application name, what kind of manifest you have, the specification of it, where it resides, what kind of server you're using, default values for the project. And then I've added specifically, they are also supporting the Helm chart itself. Under the Helm chart, you'll be able to provide many things. One of those things which caught our eye is the value files, which means that they are drawing values from a different file. The reason it's interesting here, or what got us interested in that, is that usually once you see Helm charts, you know that you have to be very specific about writing it. And if you are familiar with the manifest parsing and manifest structure, you will know that anything that can go wrong there eventually. If you are, first of all, if you are parsing it incorrectly, if you have a parser that is designated for lists or doesn't know how to read multi-line, for example. And in this case, which is more important than reading multi-lines, you'll be able to provide a different file, and this file can be maybe something that is cannot be parsed in a regular way. What is also important for us to understand is that Argo CD, as a default installation, has different pods. As I said before, it's a Kubernetes native application. So one of the pods is holding all repository data. So if you have multiple applications that you have put it on the Argo CD in order to build them and deploy them, they are all the repositories themselves that it's connected to will be residing on the same pod repository pod, excuse me. which is, again, interesting. Once you understand that, and you understand that there is a file hierarchy between them, and once you go to the pod itself and dwell into the file system, you understand that the value files themselves can be residing on this system as well. So let's think about this value file something else. Let's think of it about if you are providing it with a full path or a // what will happen then? So we would like to try this out in order to understand what is going on. Fortunately enough, they understood that, exactly as I said before. They understood 2 years ago in 2019, now it's 3 years ago. In 2019, they have discussed this specific attack path. What will happen if we'll get the // before the YAML file that we are providing? Will it be a directory traversal attack, which is a very smart take on this kind of code, and understanding of security is pretty solid here. The next step of what happens is that they are discussing how to remediate those kind of attacks and how to keep the value file under the specific root, or I would say root directory for the specific project and not other projects. So not to be confused with other projects, etc. So they had this kind of discussion. There was a spin-off to a different discussion how to get Helm to be residing only inside the child path and not outside of it. And altogether, they had a discussion before to be able to check a path. If you are getting this path, for example, this is a file that is residing into the Argo CD system. So if you visit the GitHub at the time, now it's completely different, of course. You'll get to util security path traversal, which the name, of course, not only implies, but pretty specific to the attacks that we are discussing. It has several security checks for the cleanup steps for the value that you have. The first step is the file path clean, which is a very, very common. File path is a module for Go. Clean is to clean a file path given in order to clean up for messy content, if something doesn't look like a file path, etc., etc. So this is the step one is a very crucial step. From this kind of explanation, you can understand that. Then you parse the path itself. You have a split between what kind of directory you have and what kind of base directory you have, and you are comparing the two. And if the comparison goes well, you go through and get the file drawn in order to be consumed by the project itself. On another segment of code, which leads to this code, is the repo server repository/repository.go. Each value there will go through another parsing. The first parsing will be the parse request URI, which is a function within the Argo CD project. The parsing itself will make sure that the URL that you are getting or the path that you are getting is either HTTP or a file path. And if it's an HTTP, it's supposed to be dropped altogether. If the path is absolute, meaning that you have a slash before everything and not ... If it's an absolute path and not relative path, you will also be able to consume that. And then if it is a path, you are going to enforce it to be under the current root and not under other directory that you have or the root of the system itself. Pay attention that also important to mention that Argo CD itself as a service runs with higher privileges on the system. So practically you do have access to root systems if you can read files from there and bypassing this kind of mechanism. The flow between those two functions are like that. So you have the parsing itself until the check of path is absolute. If the path is absolute, you go through the path traversal checkups, and then you go back to enforcing it to current root and then load the file. I hope it wasn't too messy. I tried to be coherent, but still into the details for you to be able to really fathom the process here. And it's very important, of course, for the next step to understand what we did from there. So as I said before, the first part of this kind of discovery or this kind of process flow is the parse request URI, which is a built-in function that Go is providing. But if you go through the documentation of parse request URI, you read exactly like that. It parses a raw URL into a URL structure. It assumes that the URL was received in an HTTP request. So the URL is interpreted only as an absolute URI or an absolute path. The string URL is assumed not to have a fragment suffix. Excuse me, pound fragment suffix. If you read it carefully, you understand that the general assumption is that the default is it is an HTTP request. If it's not an HTTP request, if it was found to be not a legitimate HTTP request URI, it doesn't look like a URI for HTTP, then it will be interpreted as an absolute URI, which you can guess what I'm going to do next. So absolute path, if you are giving that an absolute path, the parse request URI will be passing those kind of absolute paths before as a URI, and by that won't go through the checkup for the path traversal at all. So it will skip the path traversal. So all we need to do by this kind of realization, in order to circumvent the system, is to give it a URI that will look like a URI and will pass the filter without even going through with the path traversal functionality. But the interesting thing is that every kind of absolute path, if it's interpreted by parse request URI, let's say /etc/passwd, will be determined by the parse request URI as a URI, like an HTTP request, because it begins with a slash, and slash is a starting of an HTTP request as well. So this is why it's very confusing to read it. If you are not reading it carefully, you might assume that it will look as a slash or as something starting with a slash as an absolute path, and not the other way around, which actually it isn't. So to summarize the attack path itself, so we are constructing Kubernetes Helm chart that is using the value files key. The value files will point to a file with an absolute path. Now, I'm keeping you in mind that if everything went wrong here, what could have been preventing this kind of attack from the first place, and we are going to get there in a second. Just a thought for now for you, if you are wondering, I am going to touch upon that. So Kubernetes Helm chart is being inputted by an authenticated user. The Helm chart itself is combining a value files key. The value files key will have an absolute path to another application, which is deterministically known. Like if you have another application, the path to it is not random. It's something very, very specific that you can conjure yourself. Then the dummy configuration is going to read other files from the system. The files can be, by the way, not only YAML, it can be JSON, it can be other serialized structures as well. So any kind of those files can be read on the system. The default, or I would say the obvious part of it, will be secrets. Like secrets are usually provided with a different value file as well. This is part of GitOps as well, so you'll be able to operate without relying on a Helm chart. So the dummy configuration, we're going to read those kind of secrets, and then the attacker, the original attacker, will be able to read those kind of secrets, even though they shouldn't have access to those keys to begin with. Now, talking remediation, the remediation part here is very interesting. First of all, you have a very short-term solution. The short-term solution was a fix, which again, kudos to the team that have been fixing the problem systematically. They overhauled the whole parsing operation together with the path traversal operation, or anti-path traversal operation, and now starting with 2.2.24, you'll be fine. Everything is good as far as this CVE goes. Of course, I can vouch for the future. We'll see. And it is, of course, something that this is a very short-term solution for you. The long-term assessment for that will be to actually think about the architecture itself. Argo CD, as I said before, has a specific pod for the repository the repositories themselves. So a single pod for all the repositories from all the applications that are residing or built by the Argo CD system, which is architecturally, we can think of other ways to initiate that, or at least to have some kind of a segmentation between those applications, which is not file hierarchy based. So this is one of the things that I would like to see more in the future. Also, of course, communicate it with Argo CD, and to see what will the future hold for the long-term remediation. The other part of that is to the file level permission model is not to consume something as a granular service as an Argo CD, and by that we'll have to default to high permission level, but also to be able to consume those kind of parsing operations with a lower just reading your specific maybe CH root or something similar to that. So your service or application will not be able to see, at least without really escaping those kind of container from the model itself. And the other part, of course, is to audit the file access. But as I said before, this is an optional step and a very difficult one unless you really know what to look for. And the options there, to be honest, are pretty, I won't say endless. They are finite, but very, very large. So you will need to hold an operation, which is pretty pricey. The other part of that, you might ask yourselves what went wrong, because the important part is that the Argo CD guys have been developing those kind of test cases. So once they have provided the path traversal, anti-path traversal functionality 2 or 3 years ago now, they have also provided testing, unit testing for the mechanism to work. And also important that in this kind of conversation, they specifically asked about absolute paths. What will happen if, et cetera, et cetera. The testing itself didn't cover the absolute path case. The testing itself did cover the relative path case. It didn't cover the absolute path case. So a small change, it's very, very hard to say that is something that in hindsight is very, very easy to say it's something that should have gone there, but hindsight is always 20/20. But in this case, just something to learn from. If you have a test case that you would like to test, that you better pay attention to what kind of tests algorithms you have there. That could easily be detected by anyone that was paying close attention to the logs. Part of the way that we discover this kind of zero-day is by that the log itself is very verbose. So once we try to different things, after eliminating any other option, we've got to the conclusion this is the cause of this kind of attack to be happening, and this is absolutely a foolproof POC. In summary, the Helm chart itself, as we said, is the YAML manifest can contain different references. Some of those references by default are very common to be secrets, and by the scope of the implication can be led to a greater scope to other applications as well. And it leads to data exposure from the applications that are residing on the Argo CD, and maybe other things like I didn't mention, like plugins, for example, are also where installed on the repo server. Plugins are different, plugins in lack of a better words, for Argo CD to be able to do different actions on the build system. So to greatly introduce the different systems and SaaS operations into that. So if you have like plugins that also hold those kind of serialized data, you'll be able to read those kind of sensitive data as well. So this is not only confined to secrets, but just as another example there. The path traversal was expectant, which was very, very important to note. But the mechanism, unfortunately, was confusing. Maybe part of those kind of confusion is also, we can say, part of that is faulty documentation. Once you document it clearly enough, no one should be confused by those kind of mechanisms, and especially that those kind of mechanisms are residing, and many of those mechanisms are relying on the default or the common functions that the programming language provides you with. So maybe better documentation will be less susceptible to mistake there. And the testing, as we said before, we should be very, very generous with the developers to see that they are doing their work at their best effort, but also testing, especially that you discuss this kind of cases, you will be at least try to see that all of the cases that you discussed are under the testing and you're not missing something out. Again, special shout out to Jan and the gang from Argo CD that were amazing in response to that. Very quick validation. It was a Sunday when we disclosed the CVE. It was very fast for them to respond and say, yeah, we POC them. We POC the CVE ourselves. Looks great, quote unquote. We confirm and we can validate. And then I think it was Wednesday. They already had an overhauled system with all the different mechanisms together. We checked, of course, the new mechanism for some time in the time box, and then we released a mutual disclosure on both sides on Thursday. So this is a very, very quick turnaround for this kind of project. And again, thank you very much for all of those guys working so hard to be more secure every time. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I'm here, of course. Stage is yours.
Thanks, Moshe. That was amazing. Yeah, I remember when you first discovered it, seeing some of the work you did, and my brain, not to diminish the research you do, but it made me think, when looking at documentation for a project, search for the word assumes. And it feels like that might be a reasonable start.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that was great. Do you have any questions from the audience or those present?
I guess what was you've highlighted a lot of brilliant learnings, and obviously the response to the finding was so swift. What do you think is the biggest? What if people could take away one one learning that you highlighted, which one do you think they should borrow going forward? Because I mean, Argo is like a CNCF project, but now they've graduated. We can learn a lot from this.
You mean what we can learn from the engagement itself with the Argo CD team?
Yeah, what you could learn from the Argo CD team, in the way they responded. It seems like one of the best responses I've heard about.
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, the communication was very open. So they weren't afraid of saying. So I would say maybe on the contrast, where I saw not so great engagements on different vulnerabilities before, not Argo CD, others, without mentioning names, which they were very, first of all, on the first responders were very, very slow to respond. So the first response, especially on Sunday for the Israeli side, is very it's a work day, but we didn't expect to get anything on the same day even. So the SLA wasn't supposed to be that fast, but still they have responded. They were very careful of not dismissing anything, to turn every turn, and even to expand upon and to discuss openly about what else can go wrong there. And to even try to be devil's advocate against themselves. So they did a lot of legwork there, and the openness of communication. And as I said, the first response is very, very important, to be able to say, yeah, we are on it. Don't worry. By the way, I still have several CVEs sitting, I think, for years, which I didn't really follow through with anyone because either no one answered, or it was very, very hard to discuss this kind of stuff with different companies. And it's not an exaggeration, by the way. And so this is the first response is very, very important, and to have an open discussion. The second one, which no one can take from this kind of engagement, is that the professionalism level, the guys that were consulting and were engaging with the incident response were very professional. They knew their stuff in terms of security. They knew their stuff in terms of Argo CD code. So they knew their way around, and that's really contributed to the discussion and to have not only an open one, but also a very concrete one. We didn't need to go in circles. We went through it very, very fast. They understood it very, very quickly. They even, as I said, expanded upon the impact. So they because of their understanding, they could think of more complex cases, maybe less common, but more complex cases, and what will be the maximum impact, and to negotiate with it. And again, an amazing team.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Moshe. Yeah, it sounds like it's amazing, these collaborative efforts between security research and open source projects, because as you said, they talked about it and they were almost, it feels like they're on the edge of getting it right. So there's a lesson to be learned from them going forward in the way that they develop the product further and thinking about the different security measures that they're going to be put in place and the way they model what they're doing. I think it's pretty cool. And again, congratulations, Argo CD, on graduating. That was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions from anyone, or shall we close it out?
So thank you very much for having me, guys. Thank you very
Moshe,
much.
that was great.
And thank you, Larry. Thanks everyone for watching now and in the future. This is our first time using this platform. So if you are watching now in the future, leave a comment down below on YouTube and wherever it is you are, and LinkedIn. And let us know what you think of this, because this is kind of a beta test. Maybe we'll keep doing this in the future when we do virtuals.
We're experimenting, so any feedback would be absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant, for sure.
As a speaker, the platform seems fine. It's simple, and so you don't need a lot of training. So as a speaker, I give it a thumbs up.
Hey, amazing. Perfect.
Nice.
Okay. All right. I think that's it. There's no virtual pub afterwards, or no real pub, unfortunately. I guess we'll leave everyone. If you're a World Cup fan, you can go watch it. I'm not going to tell you what the score is, but it's not 0-0. And
they've all been watching on the side anyway.
I know everyone's got their. They're probably like me. Full disclosure, I have it playing right there.
Yeah, there you go. So even us are doing it.
Hey, we've been in lockdown for so long. We're not going to have one screen going. Come on.
No, come on.
Full disclosure, who's playing?
France, Morocco. Anyway, all right. Thank you, everyone. We're going to sign off.
Thank you.
Close out. This has been a wonderful DevSecOps London Gathering December. We'll see you all in January.
See you all.
Have a Christmas. Good year.
Enter the giveaway. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.